The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, recorded a message to commemorate half a century of the EU's diplomatic footprint in Canada. But she did not lean on the usual carefully crafted ceremonial language diplomats favor for anniversaries. She looked squarely at the camera and spoke with a clarity that sliced through the usual formalities. Europe and Canada will confront these crises side by side. Wars, the global energy crunch, fractures emerging within long-standing alliances. Then she chose a phrase Canadians instinctively understand. Elbows up when necessary, arms extended toward allies. Let that sink in. The EU's most influential institution had just made a public, on-the-record statement to Canada. You are not a distant observer. You are engaged in the struggle with us. Tonight, we unpack why this 50th anniversary is far more than a ceremonial milestone, why it marks a pivotal strategic juncture, and why the most consequential European actors are now inviting Canada into forms no other non-European nation has ever entered. There is a narrative here, a key protagonist, a shadow looming over every decision, and a question Canadians have rarely confronted until now. The story begins with numbers, because von der Leyen did not select this week arbitrarily. Since the comprehensive economic and trade agreement between Canada and the European Union took effect, bilateral trade has surged by 73%. Not 7, not 17, but 73. This is not a diplomatic bond sustained by goodwill alone. It represents two economies actively restructuring themselves around each other. And then comes a more recent development, one barely decoded by Canadian media. Canada has become the first non-European country in history to formally join the EU's European Peace Facility, a €150 billion rearmament instrument designed to fund joint defense procurement, close capability gaps, and strengthen the industrial base Europe needs to safeguard itself in a world where American commitment can no longer be assumed. Canada is part of this program. The United Kingdom attempted entry, negotiations failed. Canada succeeded. The agreement was formally inked at the Munich Security Conference in February of 2026. Canadian defense companies now compete for European contracts as if they were domestic entities. The Canadian Armed Forces can access low-interest loans for military modernization through European channels. Critically, Canada participates in planning discussions shaping Europe's security architecture for the coming decade. No American presence, only Canada. To trace how Canada arrived at this juncture, one must revisit Davos. In January 2026, Mark Carney stepped onto the World Economic Forum stage and delivered what many consider one of the most consequential speeches by a Canadian leader in recent memory. He did not couch his words in comfort or craft a carefully managed message. He spoke plainly, "We are amid a rupture, not a transition. The old order is not returning. Nostalgia is not a strategy." Carney explained that great powers increasingly wield economic integration as a weapon, using tariffs as leverage, supply chains as instruments of coercion. Then he articulated the line European leaders had been waiting to hear from a Western head of state. Middle powers must act together, because if they are absent from the table, they will end up on the menu. The audience gave him a standing ovation, a rare occurrence at Davos. Europe heard every word. The speech resonated because it addressed a pervasive anxiety. When Washington's rhetoric hinted that neighboring territories could be absorbed, assuming smaller nations could not defend themselves independently, the strategic calculations of every mid-sized democracy shifted. The implicit logic suggested that sovereignty and protection stem solely from military might. Accepting this premise renders nearly every nation vulnerable. Only 3 countries can genuinely defend themselves in isolation: the United States, Russia, and China. Carney's address at Davos was more than a speech. It was a framework. It proposed a wall built from the principle that middle powers, acting with coherence and shared purpose, form a legitimate and enduring alternative to reliance on a single great power. On the other side of that metaphorical wall, Europe watched quietly but unmistakably relieved. A G7 leader had spoken aloud what European heads of state had long expressed privately. Von der Leyen's message this week was a direct continuation of that defining moment. Brussels was speaking clearly. We heard you, we stand with you, and now we will construct something lasting together. That brings us to a question that briefly roared across headlines in the first months of 2026 and has since softened into a more thoughtful debate. Should Canada become part of the European Union? The Economist explored it, Finnish President Alexander Stubb raised it openly, and French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian mentioned it on a Berlin stage, somewhere between a serious proposal and a deliberate provocation. For a brief window, the discussion was genuinely open. Carney's response was decisive: no. But the reasoning behind that no is crucial. It is not the refusal of someone who underestimates Europe's value. It reflects a careful consideration of Canada's actual identity and its realistic potential. The mathematics of sovereignty alone make full EU membership effectively unattainable. Canada would have to adopt European agricultural rules, common external trade policies, allow unrestricted movement of every EU citizen, and possibly switch to the euro. It would necessitate reopening the Canadian Constitution, redistributing authority within a federation already rife with debates over jurisdiction between Ottawa and the provinces, and writing a substantial annual check to Brussels as a wealthy net contributor, all while Canadians are embroiled in a heated domestic debate over equalization payments. Geography adds another immutable constraint. 76% of Canadian foreign trade flows to the United States. The EU accounts for roughly 8%. Even in an optimistic scenario where Carney successfully diversifies Canada's trade over a decade, the American share might only drop to 50 to 60%. The United States is irreplaceable. Geography coded that reality long before any politician arrived. Here lies the deeper insight often lost in debates about EU membership. Canada does not need to become European to reap the benefits of Europe's integration. What Canada must do is become the most European country that is not physically in Europe. And that path is now crystallizing. The architecture of this approach was laid out with precision by former Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Stéphane Dion in a speech at McGill University on April 27th of 2026, delivered at an event marking the 50th anniversary. Dion articulated it clearly. Yes to partnership, no to merger. But he went further. He unveiled a third option, one already created by others, waiting for Canada to claim it. The European political community, proposed by French President Emmanuel Macron and established in 2022, gathers leaders from 47 European nations twice yearly. This forum extends well beyond formal EU membership. Every European country, except Russia and Belarus, participates. Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Ukraine, all the Balkan states, and the entire EU. Together, they discuss security, stability, and the future of the democratic world. Dion's argument was straightforward. Canada belongs at that table too. Then, something remarkable occurred. With timing so precise, it almost defies coincidence. 1 week after Dion's McGill speech, Mark Carney traveled to Yerevan, Armenia, on May 4th, 2026. He attended the 8th European Political Community Summit, and for the first time in the 4-year history of the gathering, a leader from outside Europe was present. European Council President Antonio Costa described it as politically very significant, reflecting a strong and growing alignment between Europe and Canada. During that summit, European heads of state queued for bilateral meetings with the Canadian Prime Minister. Leaders from France, Italy, Poland, Spain, Ukraine, Armenia, and the presidents of the European Council, European Commission, and European Parliament all met with Carney in the span of that single summit. Consider the structural implications. Twice a year, every major European leader convenes in one room, and Canada has now secured a seat, without surrendering sovereignty, without constitutional amendments, without adopting any European currency, agricultural regulations, or open border policies. Canada simply occupies a position at the most consequential democratic coordination forum operating in the world today. In 2025, total trade in goods and services between the EU and Canada reached $178.6 billion, according to the Canadian Prime Minister's office. Canadian direct investment in the EU stood at $297 billion. The EU ranks as Canada's second-largest global trading partner and its second-largest source of foreign direct investment after the United States. These figures are not the markers of a marginal relationship. They signal a second pillar of Canada's international engagement. The Security and Defence Partnership inked at the Canada-EU Summit in Brussels on June 23, 2025, was hailed by European officials as the most comprehensive alliance the EU has ever formalized with a non-member nation. A document alone does not constitute policy, and that distinction matters, yet the groundwork exists now in a way never seen before. Europe is evolving faster than most Canadians perceive. Bulgaria and Romania have completed their integration into the Schengen area. Bulgaria adopted the euro, joining as the 21st member of the Eurozone. Iceland is actively negotiating EU accession. Hungary, long touted by elements of the American right as a governance model, experienced a dramatic political shift at the ballot box in April of last year. Economically, Europe launched the world's first carbon border adjustment mechanism, imposing tariffs on imports from countries lacking functional carbon pricing. Canada continues industrial carbon pricing, although the consumer carbon tax has been removed, and Ottawa is renegotiating the industrial framework with Alberta. The final tariff obligations for Canadian exporters at Europe's climate gate hinge on these ongoing agreements. The tectonic plates of the Western world are in motion, and Canada has been offered a place on the side of those plates moving towards stability. There's a caution embedded in all this. A diplomatic breakthrough existing only on paper is worth precisely the value of the paper. Stéphane Dion said it at McGill, and it bears repeating. Signing agreements with Europe is the simple part. The real challenge is making them work in practice. The chief economist of Global Affairs Canada noted that Canadian businesses currently exploit only 60% of CDA's potential. More than 8 years after the agreement came into force, 10 out of 27 EU member states have yet to ratify it formally. The strategic partnership signed last June is historic, but a historic document, sitting idle, becomes merely a monument to lost opportunity. Dion's practical advice to Carney was clear. For every major agreement, assign 2 senior officials, 1 Canadian, 1 European, personally accountable for execution, with concrete targets, deadlines, and tangible consequences for failure. Stop counting signatures, start measuring results. The common thread in all these developments is this: Canada's economic resilience over the next 50 years, its role in democratic global governance, its security architecture, and its strategic autonomy all depend on whether it can transform European momentum into a durable, deepening partnership, not a merger, not the fantasy of becoming the 28th EU member. Something far more intelligent, a seat at every table that shapes the democratic world. A defense alliance deeper than any non-European country has ever reached, confirmed at the Munich Security Conference, embedded in the SAFE program, extended by the Security and Defense Partnership. A trade relationship that expanded 73% under CDA and continues to grow. Alignment on carbon and climate with the largest democratic economic bloc on the planet. And now a physical seat at the European Political Community Summit, where 47 European leaders meet twice annually to chart the democratic world's direction. It was former President Trump who nudged Canada toward Europe, making the relationship with Washington feel contingent and transactional in ways it never had before. Carney guided Canada toward Europe by articulating a vision for middle power collaboration that resonated with European leaders precisely because no one else was saying it so clearly. And this week, Ursula von der Leyen spoke those words out loud to mark 50 years of partnership that is quietly, deliberately evolving into something far larger than originally designed. Elbows up when necessary, arms open to allies. Canada and Europe, side by side, building toward the next 50 years. The opportunity is clear. The question is whether Canada possesses the institutional discipline, the political will, and the patience to transform ceremonial signatures into real-world impact. Deliver. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.